Chair, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here at this wonderful gathering. More so because at DISA I am feeling at home with Ambassador Pillai being in the chair. I served in his institute for 6 years with great pleasure and fond memories. Let me start with the subtitle of the session, which talks about economic architecture and strategic architecture. I am no competent to talk about economic architecture. We have talked enough about that. I'll concentrate on the strategic aspect. And I shall start from where my predecessor left. That is to begin with Indo-Pacific, because most of the things have been said. And I would underline that Indo-Pacific be taken as the basic concept when we are thinking of building the architecture. I was delighted last night to hear almost 4 or 5 of the ASEAN representatives talking about this concept and in a very endorsing manner. I always get puzzled when I see a great deal of hesitation and shyness on the part of India to endorse this concept. In India, in the academic debate, most of it give credit to Americans or the Japanese for this concept, which is totally, historically, culturally, civilizationally wrong. In fact, it is a concept of India and ASEAN. It is a concept of India and ASEAN civilizationally, historically, mercantile-wise, and I would say even also in the future, the way things are happening. Can't devote much time to it, but give you 1 or 2 very small instances. 1941, Kalidas Nag wrote a book called India and Pacific. I have quotations from that, don't want to go into that. But remember Nehru in 1944. I think this is a quotation which my Filipino friend gave in the morning session. Let me repeat it. The Pacific is likely to take the place of Atlantic in the future as the nerve center of the world. Though not directly a Pacific state, India will inevitably exercise an important influence there. India will also develop as the center of economic and strategic importance in this part of the world, which is going to develop in future. India will have to play a very great part in the security problem of Asia and the Indian Ocean, more specifically Middle East and Southeast Asia. And mark these words, that India is the pivot around which these problems will have to be considered. We pivoted much earlier than Obama thought about it. Forget about it. Therefore, I think India should not feel shy and any hesitation in accepting the Indo-Pacific concept. Indo-Pacific concept, therefore, can become, as I said, the basis for strategic architecture. And yesterday there was a reference to the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, or Treaty of Peace and Security, put it this way, Indo-Pacific Treaty of Peace and Security, and I think we need to consider a debate about it. A question was raised while we were having dinner as to what is this region, and I think my predecessor also said there is a lot of confusion. I would propose that this region is actually from Bay of Bengal to East Asia Sea, at least to begin with. And this is the region which it should be covered, where, of course, the maritime security would be emphasized, as we have said in so many statements, but it would be ideal if it also takes into account regional security and the internal turbulence is spilling over into regional affairs. It's a very difficult, it's a very sensitive and complex area. But eventually there are two sources of insecurity and uncertainty in our part of the world. One is the internal transformations and turbulence which is going on, democratic upsurge or ethnic sharpnesses which are emerging. And the second is the restructuring of power structure in the region. And both of them will lead to moments of anxiety and concern, and we will have to deal with them. The second principle would be non-use of force. Let us say it categorically in this treaty, if this is possible. Transparency of defense expenditures and military doctrines. I am afraid I am not developing any of these things. Other confidence building measures, and above all, conflict and dispute resolution. Bilateral, if possible. Trilateral, if it can be explored. And multilateral, collective conflict and dispute resolution, if we can subject ourselves to that. Within that frame, all this should happen within the framework of international law, including freedom of navigation and UN clause. Within the Indo-Pacific framework, I think we can use the existing structural instrumentalities with us as the building blocks. And this is what I think the eminent persons have very clearly underlined in their recommendations and report on the architecture, where ARF, ADMM Plus and EAS can be taken as the building blocks of the architecture. There is no doubt in my mind that it should be ASEAN driven, as we have all agreed. I have seen some of the commentaries by Australian commentators. Even Rudd at one stage said that probably the drivers will have to be more than ASEAN, but I for one, and there are sufficient reasons which I have already put on the table. Now, my submission here is that if ASEAN has to be in the driver's seat, there are certain preconditions which it has to address. And the first precondition is that it must resolve its own intra-group disputes and conflicts. Without that, you cannot become really an anchor. If there are bilateral disputes, any other party, any other power would harass us. And secondly, ASEAN has to evolve a security consensus. Where are the threats coming from? What would be the future nature of the threats? What are the problems we are going to face it? Unless there is a broad consensus, I understand there cannot be unanimity. Unless there is a broad consensus, I am afraid ASEAN would not be able to play the kind of role we want to assign it to ASEAN. On India's part, I think India has to reduce hugely what I call the delivery deficit on the strategic front in its interaction with various ASEAN countries and other countries of the region. Everybody knows that India has economic constraints. There is a general tendency to compare it with China. We are not that deep-pocketed. India is not that deep-pocketed, cannot afford that. Everybody also knows that India has a democratic structure, which makes decisions slow and cumbersome. But within these parameters, there is a huge scope for the delivery deficit to be reduced, particularly in the strategic and security areas, because there is a lot of expectations out of India. And wherever you go, there is a general refrain, general complaint that India is not matching to the aspirations and expectations. Having said all that, the last thing I will submit to this House, if there is a possibility to be explored of either a track 2 or a track 1.5 task force to be created to detail out the possible nuts and bolts of this architecture. Because I think the bull has not been taken by horn. Everybody has been talking about architecture, this principle, that principle. But we have not really tried to grapple with what it can contain, what it cannot. Thank you very much.